It's time for Dialogue Conspiracy with political research specialist Mae Brussell, who for 3 years has shared with us her decades' research into political assassinations and abuses of power in this country. Her program relates the news of the week to emerging evidence about the conspiracy which allegedly maintains by force its control over the legislative and judicial processes in America. And now, here's Mae.
The news of the week has been one of Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance. Sherman Skolnick claims that he has been found dead in Osceola, Michigan, and that the FBI is blacking out that news. We have to check on that. You can call his hotline in Chicago, number 312-731-1100, and pick up a tape recording on the Hoffa story. I'll do more on the Brofman kidnapping as time goes on. The garden plot I want to talk about, there's a new story coming out in Playboy magazine. That's the martial law plan that was to take place in California under the direction of Ronald Reagan, that fits into the evidence of the Squad 19 at the election that would nomination rather that would take place in Miami. In 1972 it was moved from San Diego to Miami, but the garden plot was for California. And I want to go into the revelation this week in Dallas, a person saying their plans to kill Gerald Ford and Rockefeller, which fits in with my time schedule and is consistent to what I believe is happening regarding the elections in '76. And I want to talk some more about Oswald and Agent James Hosty. The name is in the news today, but the bulk of this program, I want to get right into it, has to do with a press conference and a new news release from Los Angeles on the Robert Kennedy assassination that's very much in the news. And for those of you who aren't in our local community, on Dialogue Conspiracy preceding the show today, there was a news bulletin that the Rules Committee of the Los Angeles City Council has voted to set up a special panel to review the police department's handling of the 1968 assassination investigation of Senator Robert Kennedy. A 5-member committee is expected to be appointed to that task within 10 days. If you've been keeping up with the news of the City Council voting on opening up this information and the various researchers pulling their energies now together to get out the story of 2 guns in the Ambassador Hotel and the allegations that a security guard shot the fatal shots from the behind of Robert Kennedy, as these researchers are working very hard getting out several movies and books and press conferences. The evidence is being destroyed right and left down in Los Angeles by the police department. Not only the ceiling panels, but other pieces of evidence are being destroyed. There should be a law against a person destroying any evidence in a criminal investigation. There should be a time that this evidence be allowed to remain. Any of these conspiracies in the present or future, certainly, or information that's left from the past, should be protected. And this is one of the most important things that we should be pushing for at the legislature, state, and federal level. Don Fried heads the Committee for Democratic Freedoms in Los Angeles, and he had a press conference just a few weeks ago on some new material on the Robert Kennedy assassination. And if you want a copy of this, I'm sure he'll run it off for you if you send some money. If you want to write to me with a self-addressed envelope, I'll give you the address where you can have the document. But I want to give you the summary of what the press conference was around and then read to you an affidavit about Sirhan Sirhan as much as time will allow. The Campaign for Democratic Freedom had this new press conference, and as I say, they brought up the fact that the evidence of 2 guns, the forensic evidence, is overwhelming. This is old information that is available now. They said that several women were involved in the assassination of Robert Kennedy. And they said there were the programming of the assassins, mental programming, behavior modification, both in Dealey Plaza and in the John Kennedy assassination. Now, this is the area of new material that I've been pushing on KLRB for the last few years, but which Don Fried and the other persons are investigating now and coming in with the names and the persons involved in the programming. One was the woman in the polka dot dress who said we killed him and ran out after Robert Kennedy was killed, known as the woman with the polka dot dress. The same woman supposedly was used in both assassinations. After one of the gunmen left Dealey Plaza from the Dow Tex building, he was taken to a motel in the Midwest, accompanied by a woman in a polka dot dress. The press conference said that this behavior modification technique that was used on an agent at Dealey Plaza was also used to influence Sirhan. They now know the key operatives involved in the psychological programming and have given this evidence to Senator Church Committee. The Neuropsychiatric Division of the Office of Navy Intelligence was exposed recently for having made robot assassins or zombie hitmen who forget who they shot after the shooting is over. And Sirhan, according to these new witnesses, claimed that after he was modified to fire a gun at random, he was ordered to kill himself. And at the time that after he shot these bullets in the Ambassador Hotel, he was struggling with 8 people to try and continue that shooting. And these people said that he was going to kill himself, but he was held down, his hand was held down, and he's alive. Lawrence Kwong was another zombie who was programmed to shoot up at Jim Dunbar up at KGO, and there's a bulletproof glass, and he went in and killed Ben Munson. And this man went down the street then and then killed himself. And he had been to a private investigator many times who said he was programmed to go to KGO. He heard KGO. Another man that I believe was programmed to kill himself was Mark Essex in New Orleans that did the shootout at the end of 73, I believe it was, on the rooftop of the Holiday Inn in New Orleans. The press conference in Los Angeles continues. The Campaign for Democratic Freedom said that a woman, a co-conspirator, prepared the so-called assassination diary, exploited by the Los Angeles Police Department and Mayor Yorty. They said the diary was forged, and the witnesses now are willing to testify to this. Sirhan still doesn't remember any of the shooting. At the time he was arrested, his eyes were dilated, he was cold. The woman in the polka dot dress whispered into his ear, and he was glazed and disoriented. Sirhan later said a year later the word assassin means hashish or shashin. It means persons who are drugged or under the influence of narcotic or liquor, that the word assassin means that in his language. Sirhan also said a year later, I never planned to kill RFK physically. I never thought of doing it. It was planted in my mind. He said, I still don't believe I did it. I don't believe what has happened. My whole life stopped June 5th, 1968. The press conference went on to allege that the diary, it was illegally taken from Sirhan's bedroom, was example of automatic writing done under hypnosis, and that this diary was used, it was responsible for giving Sirhan the death penalty, but the style of the writing suggests behavior modification. The cover-up for the Robert Kennedy assassination is being exposed in more detail, again, by Don Freed and the committee down there. Of course, they named District Attorney Evel Younger, who went on to become the Attorney General of California, and he formed the Special Unit Senator to investigate the assassination, which then became the CCS, the notorious CCS, Criminal Conspiracy Section, that Louis Tackwood alleged was planning the killing of congressmen in 1972 and possibly even killing Richard Nixon. The investigation of the Robert Kennedy assassination was controlled by 3 specific CIA investigators. One was Manuel Pina, the other was Evel J. Younger, and the third was Lieutenant Enrique Hernandez. Manuel Pina, P-E-N-A, came from Washington, D.C., where he taught at the Police Training Academy and was sent out to head the investigative conspiratorial part of Special Unit Senator. Evel J. Younger was in the OSS, formerly OSS. He's still in military intelligence and is a general with standing position at the present time. Mr. Hernandez was associated with the CIA since 1963. He helped with the Unified Police Command in taking control of Latin American police and was part of a Unified Police Command while Mr. Pina was training agents, police training schools that later were to go out and overthrow countries in Latin America and use torture as one of their means of doing it. These people, as an investigative unit, concealed the evidence of a woman in the polka dot dress and the second gun. That was their area to investigate, just like Arlene Specter on the Warren Commission concealed the many bullets at Dealey Plaza and centered on the lone gun, one gun and one bullet hitting John Kennedy fatally from the head when there were multiple shots, crossfires going at the time. These men were in charge of the conspiratorial aspect of the investigation. They had evidence right from the beginning of Donald Schulman that there was another gun that went off in the Ambassador Hotel. They intimidated witnesses. They told witnesses when they spoke of a second gun that they were either mistaken or they were lying. They warned people not to talk to the police or special investigators. These are the CIA agents investigating the Robert Kennedy assassination. A gentleman named Jordan Bonifant from Life magazine wanted to find the girl in the polka dot dress. The police told him not to find her, and he was going to continue a story for life when he got orders to drop the story and don't pursue it. The diary of Lee Harvey Oswald's was planted. Sirhan's diary is planted. Arthur Bremer's diary has not been examined. It wasn't introduced in court. And Gore Vidal said the style sounded like E. Howard Hunt, that they all sounded like E. Howard Hunt. But these women now are coming forth. There's evidence of the original girl in the polka dot dress is dead, Kathy Fulmar, but another one must be available to the men in Los Angeles who had the press conference and is willing to talk. Now, in addition to the CIA being involved in the killing of Robert Kennedy and the part of the cover-up, just like people were involved in Watergate, some in covering up and some in the active participation of entering or other mischief that they were up to, there were three organized crime figures that were involved in the Robert Kennedy assassination. And these names have not been known to the public for this is the first exposure of these three men. One of them you'll recognize his name, but not in conjunction with the Robert Kennedy assassination. You know his name from the John Kennedy assassination. That's Eugene Hale Brading. The first one is Frank Donarama, Donnarauma. He also has the name Henry Donald Ramastella. He's a convicted racketeer from New Jersey and part of the organized crime group that surrounded Sirhan. He was the connecting link to help Sirhan get the job with the horses at Corona del Mar. And that was always a big link in my research on the Robert Kennedy assassination, was the link of Sirhan to the organized crime and the FBI units at the racetracks. And this particular Frank Donarama was the gentleman who helped Sirhan get the job out at Corona. Incidentally, every time Sirhan was asked about Corona or going there the afternoon previous to when Robert Kennedy was assassinated, he simply shook his head, and he's not been able to say much about his experiences at the racetrack. But a member of organized crime got him the job there. This man's name was in Sirhan's notebook. The FBI located him 10 months after the assassination of Robert Kennedy and after Sirhan's trial was over. The other man's name is Frank Chavez of the Teamsters Union. He was the chief of the Teamsters down in Puerto Rico. In 1967, he headed a branch of the Teamsters unit. He was the secretary-treasurer of the Teamsters local. He was linked to Jack Ruby and his connections to the Teamsters. And in 1967, he wanted to kill Robert Kennedy right there. And at the time, Hoffa dissuaded him from killing Robert Kennedy. And later, Chavez was murdered by his own bodyguard. But the name Frank Chavez links to the Robert Kennedy assassination and the Teamster link with Mr. Hoffa, Jimmy Hoffa, that later makes a very firm circle of the Teamsters and organized crime and the killing of Robert Kennedy and also of John Kennedy. The third man that was brought up at this press conference as being involved in the Robert Kennedy assassination is Eugene Hale Brading. The investigators in Los Angeles seem to feel that he's important because he was arrested at Dealey Plaza in November 22nd, 1963, and there's many persons who are alleging now that he was one of the gunmen at Dealey Plaza and then went to the Daltex building where he was arrested and released. And his name is published in articles and magazines now as having been one of the gunmen until a grand jury is formed or a proper legal investigation goes forward. We will not know for sure, but his name is mentioned. Well, he also was at the Ambassador Hotel the evening of June 5th, 1968, just minutes before the RFK assassination. Now, what role Eugene Brading had in the RFK, other than the fact that he was both at Dealey Plaza and the Ambassador Hotel, must be in the hands of Don Freed and the committee in Los Angeles, because we might say it's a coincidence at the very least, but they may have reasons for knowing. They made allegations in their press conference that the special unit senator knew all along about the girl in the polka dot dress, that the reports of her, like the ceiling panels, are missing now, that these other documents are being destroyed every day down Los Angeles, that the evidence of the other gun is being destroyed, that Sirhan was under some kind of a guard and discipline accompanied for days before Robert Kennedy was assassination, that he was in the constant company of one woman up to the day of the murder. Sirhan met in the room in the Ambassador Hotel on the eve of the murder. They have that evidence now, which is interesting coming out 7 years later, because when he was arrested, he had the key to a hotel room, and that was never mentioned. This is the first time this week that it's coming out in a press conference that he had the key, and also the key to a car owned by a cook by the name of Mr. Gindros, who was declared a security risk. If Robert Kennedy had been a president, Mr. Gindros wouldn't have been allowed to be in the hotel, but being as he was only a senator and a candidate for president, he was allowed to be in the kitchen, and he and Sirhan shared the keys to the car in common, and Sirhan had the keys to a hotel room in the Ambassador Hotel when he was arrested. Also mentioned in the press conference was that the radio band of the police went dead, as it did in Dallas, Texas when John Kennedy was killed, or in Memphis, Tennessee when James Earl Ray left town and Martin Luther King was murdered. The radio bands all went dead, and the parallels between these various assassinations are overwhelming and not coincidental. Now, the story of the woman helping with Sirhan's diary and being in control of Sirhan is important, because the diary is one of the big keys to all of these political assassinations. Who wrote it? Who placed it there? Who gave the false evidence that Sirhan was the murderer of Robert Kennedy, or that Lee Harvey Oswald killed John Kennedy, or James Earl Ray killed Martin Luther King, or that the Wallace shooting, Arthur Bremer worked alone? Who was behind these is the part that has always interested me. And I want to read a little bit about his diary, the remaining half hour. I want to read the testimony. It's an affidavit written by Dr. Edward Simpson. Dr. Simpson lives here at Monterey, California, and I was hoping he'd be on the show today to discuss it with you personally, but maybe some other time. He evidently had an appointment or enjoying the holiday. He said he would try to get in. But Dr. Simpson wrote an affidavit 2 years ago, March the 9th, 1973, which is just being handed out at press conferences and being written up now, and he will be on national television in the fall, regarding Sirhan. And I want to read you some points in his affidavit. There's 38, and as much as time will allow, I'm going to read them on the air, about the psychological behavior of Sirhan and what happened at his trial, and how this person was manipulated at an open trial by the psychiatrist, and the origin of this lone gunman could be perverted by the psychiatric team, while the ballistic experts perverted their evidence and the other witnesses perverted theirs. The psychiatrist had a role in this too, as well as the police department. The conclusion of the affidavit that was signed by Dr. Edward Simpson said Sirhan's trial was and will be remembered as a psychiatric blunder of the century. He says, the paragraph 38, he says, the summary I'll read to you first and then go into the other points. My repeated psychological testing of Sirhan after his trial and our interviews strongly indicate that the psychological testimony at the trial was full of numerous factual errors and was misleading to the jury. Most of the doctors testifying saw their role in proving why Sirhan killed Kennedy, which required a focus on pathology and mental illness that I found does not exist. They failed to consider the real fact in a more objective light, and failed to consider the possibility clearly suggested by the ballistic testimony and by Sirhan's own testimony under close scrutiny that perhaps Sirhan did not kill Robert F. Kennedy. Now, Dr. Edward Simpson is a practicing psychologist, does psychotherapy here in Monterey Peninsula. His formal academic background included graduation from Stanford University, an MA at New York University, Master's Psychology at University of Louisville, a PhD, magna cum laude from Heidelberg University, a diploma in community psychiatry in the state of California for training in community psychiatry and mental health. He has many degrees and has membership in professional organizations across the country and the British Society and from Europe. He's worked in up at San Quentin prison, and that's where he met Sirhan Sirhan. He had 5 years as chief clinical psychologist at Monterey County Mental Health, 6 years as senior psychologist at the California State Prison at San Quentin, 4 years of chief psychologist at Hunterdon Medical Center, New Jersey, and 2 years of clinical psychologist, Alaska Territorial Department of Health. I have tremendous respect for Dr. Simpson, and I've mentioned his name on the program many times before. This was a gentleman who fled communism. He lived in Eastern Europe. The Russians were moving over, and he fled communism and came to this country and began practicing his training here and working here. And he was what you'd say part of the system to have these jobs, to be senior psychologist at a state prison in San Quentin. Particularly through these very rough years, he was what you would say an establishment doctor, a trained psychologist working for the prisons. And yet, when he saw the evidence of what was happening in the case of an individual person like Sirhan Sirhan, he had the courage to break away from the system and say, no, this isn't right. Just like Mr. Alges had writing his book on Inside the Company, and Mr. Marchetti or Mr. Marx arguing against the CIA and what they're doing to America. These people are few in number, but they are surfacing. Louis Tackwood was one of those who took an unpopular position, left the LAPD, and exposed the same chief of police, Ed Davis, who was making the blunders on the Sirhan Sirhan case. These people aren't many, as I say, and to talk about them is sometimes as important as to talk about their work and their findings. They're unique. And I hope that you young people and you older people that listen to this show who are in a position to change the course of society or change the truth and put us back on the right track, take this position and do what Dr. Simpson did in particular and help to find the truth and find out who's doing these conspiracies. And even though he was a victim of communism and escaped there and came to this country, he still is taking a position to fight for democracy by getting rid of these evilist doctors in this particular field that he knows. And he expresses himself well in exposing them to get us back on a democratic course, because fascism and communism are equally evil. And what we're working for is a democracy. And so I want to read some of these points in this affidavit that Dr. Simpson stated, and I'll read you these paragraphs. He said during his 6 years at San Quentin, he had an opportunity to study thousands of prisoners. In the summer of 1969, I interviewed and tested extensively and repeatedly during approximately 20 weekly visits one particular inmate on death row, Sirhan Sirhan. After my visits with Sirhan were terminated, I found that he repeatedly requested his family to contact me to review his psychiatric record. And when I had the chance, I met with William Harper, a ballistic expert. I'm appalled at the conduct of the mental health professions involved in this case. I undertook the writing of this affidavit because I feel it would be a disservice to the profession of psychology to let the matter rest without further review. I discussed my findings with prison's chief psychiatrist, Dr. David Schmidt. It is our conclusion that the findings reported during Sirhan's trial in Los Angeles, California, did not match, but were in fact strictly in conflict with the findings elicited from Sirhan when he arrived at San Quentin Prison. My psychological test findings were strongly in conflict with the testimony of their trial's main witness, Dr. Diamond, Dr. Shore, Dr. Richardson, and their blind analysis of Sirhan's raw test. Nowhere in Sirhan's test responses was there evidence that he was a paranoid schizophrenic or a psychotic. The bias and errors of the psychologists, such as Dr. Shore, are well illustrated by the fact that his IQ estimates of Sirhan were significantly lower than those I've obtained at San Quentin. And he has a list of verbal IQ, 129, very superior, performance 119, bright to normal, full scale IQ 127, superior. Just digressing from Dr. Simpson's affidavit, I might say that everything I'm reading here parallels identically to the Warren Commission report of Lee Harvey Oswald having high IQs, high scores, and they're making them down a ne'er-do-well. Now back to Dr. Edward Simpson's affidavit. He said from the scores that Dr. Shore gave, where he gave Sirhan 109, for verbal at full IQ of 98, where it was 127. He inferred and related to the jury that, based on Sirhan's intelligence test, he was schizophrenic. The truth was he was performing below his true intelligence because at the prison he was under the stress of being imprisoned. He was an Arab and he didn't want to cooperate with the Jewish psychiatrist. And this distrust, his normal, was interpreted by the doctors as paranoia and schizophrenia. And it was a wrong diagnosis. Dr. Simpson said the testimony of the psychiatrist and psychologist shows errors, distortions, and probable falsification of facts. Now, those are strong words from a fellow member trained in the same field of medicine, but you can see the ballistic evidence, the ceiling panels, the sleeve cut off, the bullet evidence, everything in the examination of Sirhan. Sirhan was off, falsified, concealed, destroyed. And the psychiatric record, he said there were errors, distortions, and even possible falsification of the facts. The main reason for the errors rested largely on their belief that Sirhan killed Robert Kennedy. Their approach to examining Sirhan was highly misguided because of this preconceived notion. And that's the same thing that happened with the John Kennedy assassination. The Warren Commission went with the assumption and no other belief from the day they started that Lee Harvey Oswald killed the president, John Kennedy, and then they took every piece of evidence and falsified it, distorted it, and destroyed it that would prove anything different. And 13 years later, this November, you'll find that Lee Harvey Oswald didn't shoot John Kennedy. And the allegation here of Dr. Simpson is that all of their testimony went into the preconceived notion that Senator Robert Kennedy was killed by Sirhan. He said had they had another approach to it, and Sirhan's test and his response to the test and his behavior would have been different. Assuming that Sirhan killed Robert Kennedy, an assumption, the validity of which apparently no one seriously questioned, the mental health specialists saw their sole role to prove to them what is a known fact, rather than in discovering the truth. Consequently, their approach to his examination was incorrect. They related erroneous conclusions to the jury at the time of the trial. The Jewish doctors, particularly Dr. Diamond, was personally involved in the Arab-Jewish crisis, should have disqualified himself, and so should have the others. Psychological testing can provide valid information only when the subject trusts and fully cooperates with a psychologist. And that Sirhan did with me, Dr. Diamond said. The court psychiatrists and psychologists were not in any position to unlock Sirhan's mind. It could only be done by somebody Sirhan trusted, and Dr. Simpson said, I became that doctor. My visits with Sirhan were abruptly terminated by San Quentin's associate warden, James Park. And at that time, when Sirhan was breaking through and trusting Dr. Simpson, he was told he could not see Sirhan anymore. Dr. Simpson said Dr. Richardson testified at the trial of Sirhan that he used his test responses alone for reaching his conclusions. And yet he also admitted that not using tests, the known act of killing the senator would have led him to assume he was dealing with a paranoid personality. This is what he testified. There's no denying the first thing that would pop up to his mind is a paranoid personality. He also testified that hearing and reading in the news media about Sirhan and presuming that he killed Robert Kennedy before his testing, that he was feeling anger at Mr. Sirhan. This is what he testified on page 6443. A doctor who feels anger at his client and wishes to punish him is a poor doctor. His bias becomes an obstacle and he loses the necessary objectivity needed to arrive at a professional judgment. He is no longer a doctor but an emotional layman and should decline to give testimony just as jurors can be disqualified. The testimony of Dr. Shore, according to Dr. Simpson, the court's major psychologist witness, contained many, many errors. The test responses he claimed to have obtained from Sirhan are more sick than those obtained up at San Quentin. His test showed marked pathology and paranoia in contrast to the results that he took at San Quentin later. Had Sirhan been truly schizophrenic, with a truly chronic condition, he could never have produced the normal responses repeatedly given at San Quentin when he trusted Dr. Edward Simpson. Dr. Simpson said that the tester himself is an important variable. Dr. Shore only elicited 26 Rorschach responses from Sirhan. Another psychologist that Sirhan trusted elicited 63 responses. It was improper and unethical for Dr. Richardson to change his psychological test findings once he had read Dr. Shore's report. For those of you who have picked up on the program as I started, I'm reading an affidavit by Dr. Edward Simpson, who was a psychiatrist at San Quentin Prison, and wrote this for the court records now on the psychological blunders that were done in the trial of Sirhan. Dr. Simpson said that professionals should be working independently and not together, and that Dr. Richardson should have seen Sirhan and Dr. Shore should have seen him. But one man saw the record, he changed it to comply as members of the Warren Commission did with each other. Dr. Simpson said Dr. Richardson utilized conclusions that were made by Dr. Shore, and that these psychologists made false statements to the court saying that they worked independently. Dr. Shore gave the raw data obtained from Sirhan also to other psychologists who further compounded the errors because they didn't have any of the important information they should have of Sirhan's behavior during the testing. A Dr. Seward testified that she was asked by another Dr. Pollock to do what you call a blind analysis based on Dr. Shore's material, and she acknowledged and testified she used Dr. Shore's evaluation, which is a procedure which is very improper. To digress again, the John Kennedy assassination was written as a blind analysis of Lee Harvey Oswald by third persons who never met him in their life. And when I broke down their adjectives and how these people happened to be called as witnesses, they never saw him or never met him. And their blind analysis made up the introduction to the Warren Report and the basis of Lee Harvey Oswald. Back to this affidavit by Dr. Simpson, he said a Dr. Crane was one person who followed the correct guidelines for mental health professionals. Of all the psychologists called in, he refused to testify unless he himself could see and examine Sirhan. Dr. Diamond testified that Sirhan never talked to him very much, that Sirhan suspected him because he was Jewish, and finally Dr. Diamond admitted that he was Jewish and that his daughter and granddaughter and his son were living in Israel at the time of the trial, and that's the country that Sirhan was forced to leave when Palestine became Israel and his family was forced to leave that country. Dr. Diamond should have disqualified himself, which he didn't. Dr. Richardson's testimony was based on the assumption, as I said before, that Sirhan killed Robert Kennedy, and without his conjecture, all the testimony should have been thrown out because that was the only anchor point. There was a Dr. George DeVos who testified about Sirhan, yet he never examined Sirhan himself, and he should never been able to present in court a diagnosis of a paranoid schizophrenic. A Dr. Marcus testified on the basis of a book called The American People by a man named Musey, and later it turned out that this book was taken from another author and he should never have been allowed to testify on this book. The defense attorney, Grant Cooper, made the stipulation that Sirhan's handwriting was in this book, although he wasn't a handwriting expert, and there was no evidence to support the fact that Sirhan was influenced by a book called The American People. Supposedly, Sirhan had underlined portions of the book on McKinley's assassination. His attorney, Grant Cooper, who came from John Rosselli's case to defend Sirhan, that's the member of the organized crime that was hired by Robert Mayhew and the CIA to kill Castro. This chain of command, Grant Cooper went from Rosselli to Sirhan and stipulated there was handwriting in a book that would make his client appear to have premeditation or thought of assassination when Grant Cooper was not an expert in handwriting at all. Mr. McGowan talked about the fine writing and the underlining notations in this book, and yet it wasn't consistent with Sirhan's writing, and he should not have been allowed to testify in that. Dr. Simpson said that reading and studying the transcript of Sirhan's trial, there is the dominant impression that the psychological team, largely made up of Jewish doctors, pooled their efforts to prove that Sirhan the hated Arab was guilty and insane, a paranoid schizophrenic, whereas Sirhan is not and was never a paranoid schizophrenic. The jury was fed pooled information by a composite of doctors and by the main author of the defense strategy being Dr. Diamond. And Dr. Diamond was wrong. Dr. Simpson has said he was not objective enough. He didn't get an impartial search for truth. The testimony that followed had a textbook stereotype description rather than life personality of a very bright young Arab, Sirhan Sirhan. Sirhan became the center of a drama that unfolded slowly to discredit, embarrass psychology and psychiatry as a profession. This is what Dr. Simpson claims. He says he was the center of this drama, the true center of which probably still lies very much concealed and unknown to the general public. He was merely a double, a stand-in, sent there to draw attention. Was he, Dr. Simpson asked with a question mark, was he at the scene to replace someone else? Question mark. Did he actually kill Robert Kennedy? This was asked in 1973, and in 75 it's becoming more and more apparent that he didn't. Dr. Simpson said in his affidavit, whatever the full truth of the Robert Kennedy assassination might be, it still remains locked in Sirhan's mind and in other still anonymous minds. Sirhan told the doctors, Dr. Simpson up at San Quentin when he was up there, that he never did trust Dr. Diamond, and that he made up stories both to please him and confuse him because at the time he didn't trust him. But Dr. Diamond erred always in assuming the role of a gun expert. He talked about Sirhan shooting a certain kind of gun and saying he was careless and irresponsible, where Dr. Diamond did not know about handwriting or fingerprints or weapons at all, and Dr. Diamond saw no evidence of mental illness in Sirhan. If Diamond's label for Sirhan was dementia precox was correct, Sirhan would have to be incurably insane. He's not incurably insane at all. Such patients are usually confused, withdrawn, regressed, seldom violent, and whatever strange behavior I showed in court, Sirhan told Dr. Simpson, it was only the result of my outrage against Dr. Diamond and other testimony. They were saying things about me that were grossly untrue, nor did I give them permission to testify in my behalf in court. Now, this again happened at Jack Ruby's trial, where they tried to make him insane. A conclusion emerges from the court transcript that Sirhan's notebooks were modified to support the improper diagnosis of a paranoid schizophrenic. Dr. Diamond said that schizophrenia is a disease of the mind that's all-pervasive, and admitting that he had no evidence or nor proof at any time that Sirhan was totally disorganized or sick. And across the board, this affidavit goes on to say that numerous witnesses saw Sirhan as highly intelligent, well-oriented before the shooting, which is consistent with his behavior at San Quentin, and now he's at Soledad, which is in listening of KLRB, and I hope his friends are listening and reporting Sirhan each week on how these press conferences are going relating to him. Dr. Diamond used hypnosis in 6 sessions out of 8 with Sirhan, and Dr. Simpson said what was the purpose of it and suggests that Dr. Diamond was planting an idea in Sirhan's mind, maybe ideas that weren't there before. And did they plant the idea that he killed Robert Kennedy? Why was he hypnotizing 6 out of 8 sessions? When Dr. Diamond was unable to get Sirhan to admit that he wrote the notebook, he testified, this is the testimony, page 6979 of the trial, I undertook some experiments and possible hypnotic suggestion. This admission strongly suggests the possibility of hypnosis being used to implant the hypothetical idea in his mind rather than uncovering the facts. A lie detector and not hypnosis should have been used in finding out whether Sirhan killed Robert Kennedy. Now, to the notebook, the handwriting in the notebook, according to Dr. Simpson and other experts also, differs drastically from the handwriting in numerous test materials which he gave Sirhan and San Quentin. It was entirely different than that notebook. Whether someone else wrote the notebook or whether they were written under special influence such as hypnosis is entirely unsolved. If somebody hypnotized him when the notebooks were written, who was it? Unfortunately, the defense trial never brought in a handwriting expert. Dr. Diamond testified, I doubt that Sirhan believes it was truly his writing in the notebook threatening the assassination of Robert Kennedy. I know that he does not believe that he actually wrote the automatic writing that he brought into the courtroom. Now, Sirhan denied consistently that he wrote that notebook. It wasn't that the handwriting is off from what he usually writes. He says he didn't write it, and Dr. Diamond asked, and he put in his affidavit who wrote the notebook, because Sirhan wanted to know who wrote the notebook. And the question came up whether they had hired a handwriting expert to examine to see if it was forged or forge his handwriting. That Sirhan said, "Did you bring in a handwriting expert to see this diary? You know, the notebook said RFK must die, and Robert Kaiser, who worked for Rand Corporation and Lifetime, Henry Luce, was in the cell with Sirhan 2 hours before the police could interview him or be with him, and he made money off this book. He travels around selling his book as an expert on assassinations. His links to the past are suspicious as being an intelligent agent like E. Howard Hunt, and he was with Sirhan, and this diary was not written by Sirhan, and Sirhan claimed he didn't write it." Dr. Pollock testified at the trial that Sirhan doubted the handwriting in the notebook was his. He didn't believe it was his, and at no time in his life did Sirhan ever offer the admission that he wrote that notebook. And yet those notebooks were the most important piece of evidence that led to the conviction of Sirhan at the time of his trial. Sirhan rejected and disowned those notebooks. They were illegally seized in his house. He rejected them. According to a handwriting analyst's testimony, the handwriting in the notebooks was by someone who was taking a little more pains than he ordinarily does. It is unlikely that people do this in their notebooks, and it is more so done by someone trying to omit the handwriting. Mr. Sloan, the prosecution handwriting analyst, was very likely influenced in his testimony because he believed that Sirhan killed Robert Kennedy. "I strongly suspect," says Dr. Edward Simpson, "the notebooks are a forgery, for the thinking reflected in them is foreign to Sirhan that I carefully studied at least 20 or more sessions." Dr. Diamond, the defense psychiatrist, blocked all further evaluation of Sirhan by Dr. Pollock when Pollock started to disagree with his views on Sirhan. He didn't agree that Sirhan was schizophrenic or paranoid schizophrenic, so that Dr. Pollock was kept from giving any more opinion to Dr. Diamond. He said that he was not psychotic. It's very difficult to hypnotize a psychotic person, and yet Dr. Diamond testified that Sirhan was easy to hypnotize. Edward Simpson, Dr. Simpson, said it is a more proper and ethical evaluation of Sirhan. All the psychologists and the psychiatrists should have worked independently. They should not have worked as a team. They contaminated and influenced each other's views and findings. For example, Dr. Richmond's testimony states that Dr. Shore's findings made him change his conclusions, and Dr. Diamond eliminated Dr. Pollock's study when he didn't agree with him. They should have worked independently. They should have presented independent thinking to the jury, but instead they all met in a huddle in Grant Cooper's office. The defense attorney, Drs. Diamond, Pollock, Richardson, Shore, and Marcus met with the defense attorney and then brought one composite, like the Warren Commission members did of Lee Harvey Oswald. They all came out with one opinion and presented it to the jury. Furthermore, a Dr. Shore was so anxious to create this paranoid schizophrenic that he plagiarized during the trial. He brought a book out by Dr. James Brussell, no relative of Mae Brussell. It's called The Casebook of Crime Psychiatrists, and he has a chapter called The Mad Bomber and Christmas Eve, and he took two cases not similar at all to Sirhan's, and he told the jury there was a striking similarity and borrowed verbatim from this particular book, and then was called down on it later and tried to compare Sirhan's mentality to the chapters in Mad Bomber. This is Dr. Shore copied 6 quotes at the trial to the jury, 6 quotations from a chapter of the Mad Bomber, and inserted them in his final report on Sirhan when they pertain to different persons altogether, different kinds of violence, and they were plagiarized from a book by a Mr. Brussell, Dr. Brussell, and Dr. Shore used those at the trial and went on to say that when Sirhan was between the age of 4 and 14 that he had delusions, and he never saw the young man at that time, had nothing to base it on. Sirhan informed Dr. Simpson that he was never warned that all his responses to psychological tests that were used by psychiatrists prior to the trial were going to be used against him. And Judge Walker allowed this to happen. And in court, when they were using this testimony, Sirhan asked to speak. Sirhan said, "Your Honor, sir," and the judge said, "You sit down or I'll do to you what I told you I was going to do." And they shut him up, and Sirhan had to sit there and listen to this testimony against him, and he was bound in silence while his defense attorney and these psychiatrists were throwing this out against him. In summary, I've been reading an affidavit of Dr. Edward Simpson, a psychologist who lives in the Monterey Peninsula, who wrote a report for the court that will be used if there is a new trial, hopefully, on Sirhan. He called the psychiatrist who handled the case responsible for the psychiatric blunder of the century. He said the testing that he did on Sirhan showed him to be bright and capable, not mentally sick at all, and that the psychiatrists ganged together with what would be the defense attorney, which turned out to be the prosecution as well as the defense, and nailed Sirhan. And now 7 years later, we are going to find that Sirhan did not get a single bullet, into the body of Robert Kennedy. It came from behind, from a guard from Lockheed that was sent from Lockheed. And that's how American history was written and will be rewritten. And thanks to Dr. Edward Simpson and some hard workers, maybe the truth will come out. Well, that's it for this week. We'll see you next week on Dialogue Conspiracy and get back to some of the other news of Oswald. And I'll see you next week.
This has been Dialogue Conspiracy with political research specialist Mae Brussell, who for 10 years has been researching the facts behind political assassinations and conspiracies in this country. Dialogue Conspiracy originates with KELRB FM in Carmel, California.